much like any country, and it certainly hasn't escaped the notice of people in China that Chinese factory workers have been laboring hard to make stuff that gets sold here, and the dollars come back, and China has effectively invested in empty, now foreclosed houses in Orange County, as opposed to building up a modern housing stock for a lot of poor people in China. That simply can't go on forever. And China is likely to begin directing more and more of its capital to developing its own country. Now, let me be clear, I'm not suggesting that foreign creditors are suddenly going to sell the dollar en masse and we're going to have a dollar crisis when we're discussing trillions of dollars, and China does own more than $2 trillion worth of assets. Change is going to be gradual, but I am saying that we do well to assume that we can't count indefinitely on the willingness of foreigners to lend us the money to keep spending while we ignore our debts and the pressure building up in our economy. Peter Pan, to get back to the metaphor, never leaves Neverland, but we don't have that luxury. We've effectively run out of fairy dust. We have to replace our ceaseless pursuit of the next gold rush with something solid. We have to get back to hard work and patience and innovation, and we have to live on what we earn at work. How do we do this? I mean, in essence, we have to generate a lot of jobs. This is the transformation that we really require. We need to figure out how to put millions of people back to work in jobs that pay enough to enable them to live in decent housing and send kids to school and get health care and live the American middle class life that most of us hopefully take for granted. How do we do that? We have to identify our strengths in the global economy, and we have to do more of that. And public dollars have to be targeted at research institutions to increase our know-how in promising industries, and incentives that have to be directed at private ventures that take these new ideas and turn them into real businesses. We already have plenty of examples of how kind of public-private partnership works. This is where the internet came from. We devoted an awful lot of money to Stanford and UC Berkeley and other institutions in California, and the great ideas that came out of those places resulted in the internet, which eventually gave us a lot of businesses that are still with us today and still employing a lot of people and creating a lot of wealth. Where are the next such advances? There's no blueprint, but there's some obvious low-hanging fruit. Renewable energy is among the most promising areas. This is an area that the Obama administration is paying quite a good deal of attention. There's money in the stimulus bill to increase research in renewable energy, to support actual development of renewable energy. There was a tax credit that got renewed to encourage utilities to buy more and more energy from solar providers, wind providers, and building the necessary gear, such as wind turbines and solar panels, has already emerged as a particularly useful way of producing lost manufacturing jobs. Let's remember, manufacturing was traditionally a way in which lesser skilled people could earn enough to support their families at a middle class standard, and that's where we've seen these big losses. Well, consider the case of Newton, Iowa. This is a place I write about in my book, where Maytag was headquartered, and in 2007, in this town of about 16,000 people, Maytag shut everything down and moved away, and 1,800 jobs disappeared, just like that, in a town of 16,000 people. This was catastrophic. I mean, this was the biggest employer. This was a company that was responsible for financing the development of the local community college, the library system. Most of the jobs around town, one way or another, were connected to people earning paychecks at Maytag, so they could go to the local florist and buy flowers for their spouse on their birthday, or shop for a home from a local realtor. Well, less than a year after Maytag departed, the local officials there had attracted 700 new jobs in the wind power industry. Iowa, it so happens, sits on the Great Plains, which is considered to be the Saudi Arabia of wind, and the state was very skillful in attracting investment there. It was clear that billions of dollars were going to go into developing wind farms across the Great Plains, And this gear is big, it's expensive to ship. It can be made in China cheaply or in Mexico, but better to build it close to where it's going to be deployed. And so Iowa managed to use this story to attract billions of dollars of investment and hundreds of jobs. The life sciences, another promising area. And I'm laying these out not because I'm suggesting that we all either need to go off and make our living in a wind turbine factory or in a biotech plant, but because these are ultimately models that can help us figure out how to generate jobs so that people who earn paychecks in those places can distribute them everywhere else. So that if you're an artist and you need somebody to be able to afford to patronize your work, there's got to be a source of growth in this economy to create what economists call a virtuous cycle. In North Carolina, the state has in recent years lost thousands of formerly good-paying jobs in things like tobacco, textiles, and furniture. And North Carolina directed a lot of funding to large research institutions in biotech, and then created an incubator to help entrepreneurs set up businesses in the state and take advantage of the local expertise, and ultimately generate a lot of good jobs. They also set up a training program at the community college system to train people, many of them former textile and tobacco workers. And these people became the foot soldiers of what today is a very large cluster of biotech businesses, where roughly half the jobs require somewhere between a high school degree and a 2-year associate degree, and they pay wages that typically start at about $30,000 a year. I tell you that because you don't need an advanced degree. There's this idea that we have an educational crisis, which we do, but we could solve our educational crisis quite a bit through 2-year degree programs, these associate degree programs, certificates that could enable people to get some pretty decent jobs if we get our incentives straight and we invest in the right things. I met a woman in the course of my reporting in North Carolina, a woman named Regina Whitaker, who had gone to work at a textile mill in the center of North Carolina. And her mother had worked there, she had cousins, and I think a brother who had worked there. And as production shifted to Latin America and then to Asia in the 1990s, she started to get very fearful about her job security, and she jumped at the chance to enroll in the state's first wave of training for a career in biotech in 2004. Well, today she's a lab technician at a company called Targacept, which is a company that was spun off by the old R.J. Reynolds tobacco company, which I just find fascinating. I mean, here's this company, R.J. Reynolds, which built up intellectual capital in understanding how the nicotine receptors of the brain can be used to addict people to cigarettes, which we now know kills people. And that same body of research is being used now to develop drugs that treat Alzheimer's and potentially other diseases. I mean, that's a very useful model for what we have to go through as a society in terms of getting away from this addiction to credit default swaps, which works great so long as the money's moving and people believe in the fantasy, but proves to be cancerous when it shuts down. Now, I do want to emphasize, I'm just giving you a couple of places where we've seen a partnership between government and public money and private industry in generating good jobs. This is not a template. This is not a recipe, and it could be that the next big thing is not a big thing at all. It could simply be a question of having our economy get back to focusing on innovation in established areas to just simply improve goods and services and create jobs by making things that we already know work better. And I'll give you, one last example. I mean, think about the modern day wine industry and how decades ago the farms of California's Central Valley were mostly just producing, commodity crops, crops that didn't attract a premium. And what would you pay if you bought wine by walking into a grocery store and there was a bottle of USDA approved standard California red wine? But what do people pay to drive to a chateau in the Napa Valley to buy a particular vintage from a prized vineyard? Well, they pay a lot. And I mean, there's an example of taking something that's really quite ordinary. There's no magic in growing grapes.